In October 1347, when Genoese galleys arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily, the dock workers of the time could not have possibly guessed that these were no mere merchant vessels, nor was their cargo limited to Eastern silk or spices. These ships, entering as they sliced through the glittering waves under the warm Mediterranean sun, were like silent messengers announcing the prelude to the most terrible catastrophe in human history, and a strange, eerie silence hung over their decks. Those who approached to moor the ships had no choice but to recoil in horror at the tragedy discovered within. Most of the sailors were already cold corpses, and even the few survivors, barely clinging to life, had taken on a grotesque appearance, their bodies blackened and oozing pus and blood. This was not merely the start of an epidemic, but the arrival of a colossal darkness that would shake the very foundations of the immense civilization known as medieval Europe and test the human soul itself. Yet no one knew where this demon had come from or why God had inflicted such punishment. Port officials immediately attempted to quarantine the ships and send them out of the harbor, but the invisible seeds of death were already seeping deep into the alleys of Sicily via the ropes, the breath of the unloading laborers, and in the fur of the rats hiding in the ship's holds. Before this calamity struck, mid-14th century Europe appeared to be at the peak of prosperity, with an expanding population and active trade, but its interior had already reached a breaking point. Thanks to the warm climate that had persisted for centuries, agricultural output had increased and the population had exploded. But as the 14th century began, the climate shifted rapidly, and a cold period known as the Little Ice Age arrived, causing the Great Famine to first sweep across the European continent. People were suffering from starvation, their immune systems severely weakened by malnutrition, and the insides of city walls were already akin to massive powder kegs due to the influx of the poor and the unsanitary environment. Filth and excrement overflowed in the narrow alleys, and the lifestyle of the time, where livestock and humans lived entangled together, provided perfect conditions for an epidemic to run rampant. Yet the intellectuals and clergy of the era could not predict the catastrophe that this lack of hygiene concepts would bring. Because they tried to interpret every disaster as God's will or the movement of constellations, they believed without a doubt that the approaching Black Shadow was a supernatural punishment rather than a simple natural phenomenon, which later became a cause for amplifying the fear even further. The march of death was moving slowly westward along the vast steppes of the East and the Silk Road long before reaching Europe, and the prevailing theory regarding its origin is that it began in the arid plains of Central Asia or the remote regions of China, when the massive iron hooves of the Mongol Empire connected East and West as one. Their efficient postal system and trade route, the Pax Mongolica, ironically served as a superhighway for lethal bacteria to travel rapidly along with civilization's goods. Rodents mingled in the caravans, and the fleas parasitic in their fur changed hosts, slowly expanding the territory of death westward to every place human feet could reach. According to Eastern records, rumors traveled on the wind about entire villages being wiped out by a nameless plague and corpses piling up to form mountains. But for Europeans, these were merely unfortunate stories of a distant, exotic land, and they could not imagine it would become their own fate. However, the wheel of fate reached a decisive turning point in 1346 through the siege between the Mongol army and Genoese merchants in the trading city of Kaffa on the coast of the Black Sea. A mysterious plague suddenly began to circulate within the army of the Golden Horde besieging Kaffa, and as soldiers began to drop dead one after another, the Mongol commander Janibeg Khan decided to execute the most horrific biological attack in human history to break this desperate situation. They used catapults to launch the corpses of soldiers who had turned black and died from the plague over the walls and into the city of Kaffa. The rotting corpses that flew through the sky and fell into the fortress became more than just a source of fear. They became actual sources of infection,
turning the city into a living hell. There was nowhere to hide from the rain of death pouring from the sky, and the Genoese merchants, stricken with stench and terror, had no choice but to abandon the city and board their ships. But they did not realize that death had boarded with them on those very vessels fleeing the scene. The ships escaping Caffa left the Black Sea, passed through Constantinople, and headed for the Mediterranean. And with every stop on that voyage, they unloaded death at the ports, beginning the countdown to destruction for the European continent.
Roll, hiding inside the ships in 14th century Europe, were climbing up and down the ropes, consuming the sailors' provisions, and the oriental rat fleas, Xenophila chiopes, clinging to their bodies, were craving the blood of new hosts, humans, while harboring the plague bacteria in their bellies. Returning to Sicily in 1347, the residents of Messina were soon struck with astonishment at the terrible signs appearing on their own bodies. Within just a few days of infection, black lumps or buboes, the size of eggs, rose up in their groins or armpits, accompanied by high fever. These lumps caused excruciating pain as they hardened, and soon they would burst, pouring out pus and blood that reeked of a foul stench, which was a signal of physical collapse, indicating that the lymph nodes within the body were being completely destroyed by the plague bacteria. Even more terrifying were the symptoms of septicemic plague, where bleeding occurred under the skin, creating dark purple spots all over the body. Because of this appearance, people called this disease the Black Death and trembled in fear. Patients vomited blood and suffered from difficulty breathing, often wandering the streets in a state of delirium before collapsing. Faced with these bizarre symptoms, whose cause could not be determined by the medical knowledge of the time, it was common for even doctors to abandon their patients and flee. It became a daily occurrence for a healthy neighbor from yesterday to be found as a cold corpse this morning, and bodies that could not be given a funeral began to pile up on the streets of Messina, with the smell of rotting corpses covering the entire city, to the point where even breathing became painful. The Black Death that scorched Sicily did not stop, but spread to the gateways of the Italian mainland, Genoa, Venice, and Pisa in early 1348, spreading at an uncontrollable speed, like wildfire catching on to dry grass. Even Florence, a splendid city preparing for the dawn of the Renaissance, could not escape this wave of death, and Giovanni Boccaccio, the greatest writer of the time, left a vivid record of the tragedy in his book, The Decameron. According to Boccaccio's records, death arrived so swiftly and without warning that a sturdy young man who dined with his family in the morning would be dining with his ancestors in the other world by evening, and a moral collapse occurred where the foundations of humanity crumbled, with parents abandoning children and wives fleeing from husbands. The city's functions were paralyzed, and when even the bureaucrats and clergy who were supposed to maintain law and order died of the disease or hid in fear, the city turned into a lawless zone, a chaotic scene where looting and arson ran rampant. The church bells rang endlessly to announce deaths, but eventually there was no one left to ring the bells, plunging the city into a strange silence where only the sound of cartwheels carrying bodies and the shouts of corpse collectors yelling, "Bring out your dead," echoed emptily. Medieval people firmly believed this disease was spread through corrupted air, or miasma, so they made tearful efforts to purify the air by tightly closing windows, burning incense, or sprinkling vinegar. The streets were full of people holding fragrant flowers or pouches of herbs to their noses to block the stench, and doctors took on the chilling appearance of examining patients wearing bizarre masks shaped like bird beaks filled with herbs. However, such efforts were useless against the plague bacteria transmitted through fleas and rats, and the act of gathering in enclosed spaces to pray or nurse the sick actually resulted in accelerating the infection. People flocked to churches to appease God's anger, but ironically, the most holy places, cathedrals and monasteries, became the most dangerous clusters of infection, where countless priests and monks died in agony while begging for God's salvation. Some, realizing death was imminent,
indulged in dissipated pleasures, spending their final moments with alcohol and entertainment, while others sought salvation through abstinence and penance. Human reactions to death were extremely polarized.
The shadow of death that swept Italy soon crossed the Alps into France and across the sea to England, to the land of France, already exhausted by the 100 Years' War. The Black Death appeared as an enemy more terrifying than any other. Arriving in Paris in the summer of 1348, the Black Death instantly turned this densely populated metropolis into a massive graveyard, and even the French royal family was not safe, suffering the humiliation of having to flee. Abandoned bodies floated in the Seine River, and groans did not cease even beyond the splendid walls of the Louvre Palace. According to records of Paris at the time, more than 800 people died daily, and as cemeteries ran out of space, mass burials, digging huge pits and stacking bodies in layers, became routine. Because the soil covering them was thin, terrible sights occurred where bodies were exposed when it rained or were damaged by wild animals, and survivors watching this fell into despair, sensing that they too were destined to be thrown into those pits. In this period, across all of Europe, a sentiment of desperation, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, mixed strangely with the apocalyptic fear of repent, for the end is near, driving society as a whole into madness. In June 1348, when a ship from Gascony dropped anchor at the port of Melcombe Regis in southern England, England's fate was also sealed. At the time, England's humid and frequently rainy climate provided the optimal environment for the plague to mutate from the bubonic form, which attacks lymph nodes, into the pneumonic form, which spreads directly between people through coughing and droplets. Villages on the road to London rapidly turned into ghost towns, and cities like Gloucester and Oxford locked their gates tightly to control the entry of outsiders, choosing isolation. But death mocked the walls and seeped in with the rain. A chronicler in Bristol recorded that the living were not sufficient to bury the dead, which was not merely a rhetorical expression, but a reflection of the disastrous reality where the entire adult male population of a village would be wiped out, leaving no workforce to move the bodies. The landscape of England, with ownless livestock howling on muddy roads where rain fell incessantly, and cold houses lining the streets with no smoke rising from chimneys, was a scene straight out of the apocalypse. Entering London in the fall of 1348, the Black Death began in the narrow, filth-ridden slums along the Thames and devoured the areas where royalty and nobility resided with ferocious intensity. London citizens attempted to handle the hundreds of bodies pouring out daily by creating a massive common grave at Smithfield, but the pits filled with bodies as fast as they were dug, leading to a horrific situation where there was no land left to bury the dead, forcing them to dig up existing graves and stack new bodies on top. The fact that death is equal for royalty and beggars alike was cruelly proven when Princess Joan, daughter of Edward III, died of the Black Death in Bordeaux while on her way to Spain for her wedding. The fear that even royal authority could not stop this disease struck the ruling classes of all Europe. The judicial system collapsed, so trials were not held, and there was no one to catch serfs who abandoned their lord's land and fled. The rigid hierarchy that sustained society began to crack slowly before the immense power of death. People no longer planned for the future. Farmers did not sow seeds, and merchants closed their ledgers, for the extreme uncertainty of not knowing whether they would even open their eyes the next morning had completely broken the human will. Fear of a catastrophe with no known cause soon mutated into a collective madness seeking someone to blame, and ridiculous conspiracy theories that Jews had poisoned the wells spread like wildfire across Europe. With religious enmity already accumulated through events like the Crusades, the masses tried to find the cause of the Black Death not in invisible bacteria, but in visible heathens, leading to the Strasbourg massacre, one of the ugliest slaughters in history. In February 1349, even though the Black Death had not yet reached Strasbourg, under the pretext of prevention, 2,000 Jews were herded onto a massive wooden platform and burned alive. Watching the flames and hearing the screams for mercy, the crowd believed this was justice to appease God's anger. But ironically, the Black Death struck Strasbourg immediately after the massacre, judging the slaughterers all the same. The intellect of Europe was completely paralyzed during this period, and although Pope Clement VI issued a bull proclaiming the innocence of the Jews, the madness of the terror-stricken crowd ignored even the Pope's authority
and continued the festival of blood. Madness appeared not only as massacre, but also in the form of extreme asceticism. Groups known as flagellants wandered from village to village, abusing their own bodies in an attempt to wash away humanity's sins. They marched wearing black robes with crosses at the front, singing hymns, and upon arriving in a town square, they would strip off their upper garments and perform a ritual of whipping their own backs with scourges embedded with iron spikes until blood flowed. People who believed the superstition that the Black Death would retreat if the flagellant's blood touched the ground flocked to touch even their blood-stained clothes, but in reality, they acted as the surest spreaders of the disease, carrying it as they wandered from place to place. Initially receiving popular support in place of church authority, they gradually became corrupt, criticizing the church and coveting secular power, and until they were condemned as heretics by the papacy and disbanded, they drove European society into even greater chaos. In the wake of the flagellants' procession, only more corpses and despair remained instead of salvation, and their desperate struggle towards God was a sad self-portrait showing how severe the mental panic experienced by medieval people was. When the intensity of the epidemic finally waned around 1351 after 3 years of hell, Europe had lost between a third and half of its population. But paradoxically, new opportunities arose for the survivors. As labor became extremely scarce, lords had to offer better conditions to retain serfs, wages skyrocketed, and the process of the natural dissolution of the chain of serfdom, which had lasted for hundreds of years, began due to economic logic. Unexhabited arable land turned into pastures, creating an opportunity for the wool industry to develop, and as a small number of survivors inherited the legacies of the dead, a strange economic boom occurred with the concentration of wealth and an increase in per capita income. Commoners could eat meat and white bread which they dared not imagine before, and laborers realized their value and began to demand better treatment, which later became the spark for peasant revolts like Wat Tyler's Rebellion. The Black Death was a cruel reaper that took countless lives, but at the same time, it was the most powerful historical catalyst that shattered the shell of the old and archaic medieval feudal society and forced it to move towards a new era called the modern era. Furthermore, the Black Death caused irreversible cracks in people's mental world, especially their unconditional faith in the church, as they witnessed the contradiction of sincere and devoted priests dying first while caring for the sick, while selfish priests who fled survived. The fundamental question, why does God not protect his servants, was raised, and as the intellectual priestly class who could speak Latin died in large numbers and were replaced by low-quality clergy, the authority of the church fell to the ground. This skepticism gave birth to a unique genre in art called Danse Macabre, Dance of Death, where paintings of popes, emperors, beauties and beggars alike being led by skeletal hands to dance towards the grave satirized the futile equality before death. People felt keenly how fleeting life in this world was, and this became an opportunity to prepare the spiritual soil for humanism, shifting focus from God-centered thinking to human life and happiness in the present world and the Renaissance. Just as the saying goes that dawn comes when the darkness is deepest, European civilization passed through the deepest tunnel of darkness in human history, paying a painful sacrifice, and finally awoke from the long sleep of the Middle Ages, preparing to greet the new dawn of the modern era.